Behind the Built Environment, the podcast from BESA, the UK's leading trade body for the building engineering services sector.
Hello, I'm David Frise, Chief Executive of BESA. This is Behind the Built Environment, the podcast that delves deep into the major issues facing our industry. Through in-depth conversations with key industry leaders, we'll explore the trends, challenges, and innovations that shape the built environment. And joining me today is Beth West. Welcome, Beth.
Thank you.
She is founder and director of Navigate Advisory and a former chief executive of East West Railway Company. Beth has spent her career at the sharp end of major infrastructure and commercial leadership project delivery. Her background includes project finance, Transport for London, London Underground, Thames Tideway, Balfour Beatty, HS2 and East West Rail. Quite a journey.
It has been.
A transport journey, in fact. So we always start the question piece with some quick fire questions. So these require yes/no answers, never as easy as you think it's going to be. So number one, can the UK solve more of its infrastructure challenge by making better use of existing assets rather than always build new?
Yes.
Has complexity become a bigger threat to delivery than cost?
Yes.
Is building more always the best answer to growth?
No.
Is upfront capital cost still the best way to judge whether a project is good value?
No.
Is the industry short not only of people to deliver projects, but also of the expertise needed to make better decisions at the start?
Yes.
I think you win the prize for the most affirmative yes/no's we've had so far. The question we always like to start with, did you choose the career or did the career choose you? How did you end up sat here today in the current role?
So I'm giving you my politician's answer. It's a little bit of both. I became really interested in infrastructure in particular. After the first year of doing my master's, I was in Bologna. And we were studying the European Union and how France and Germany stopped shooting each other because of the integrated economic systems and how their economies were developing a lot. And the summer after that, I spent in Croatia when the war in the former Yugoslavia was going on. And I thought it'd be a jolly good idea if people there stopped shooting each other and looking at how do you get people to really invest in their own development and stop having wars. It is, people when they're richer tend not to shoot at each other. So I became very, very interested in economic development, and I wanted to do things that weren't going to impose cultural values upon anyone. And I came across project finance and infrastructure because everybody needs infrastructure to develop, and every economy needs water and power and roads and broadband in order for their economies to grow. So I chose to go into project finance after this bit of exploration into how do I help people's lives get better, and then it's been literally a journey since there.
And you founded Navigate Advisory.
Mm-hmm.
What does that do?
So it's a consultancy of me basically, but it is about helping client organizations and look at how do you deliver more effectively. I think their clienting isn't professionalized, which is a frustration of mine. It's not something that's viewed as something that you need skills to develop. And I think having been around a lot of projects and pop-up clients, there's a pattern of behavior that keeps repeating itself. And so what I want to do myself is help clients break out of that pattern and start the projects properly and move into being really cost effective in their delivery and ideally having a less of an impact on the planet, but get the same outcomes.
It's interesting, in the week that the government announced the end of retentions in construction, there were several comments around, how do we protect clients from this? And surely the answer is procure better. And then you would not have such a problem with defects.
Yes. I mean, I think a lot of things with defects is you don't want your contractors hanging around afterwards anyway. So there's a whole thing about getting your scope right and making sure you're assuring it properly before you declare completion. And there are lots of reasons, there are lots of good commercial reasons why people declare practical completion before things are actually done, which I totally understand. But behavior of contractors and contractor accounting, which is sometimes very interesting, means that it's going to be very, very difficult for anybody to come back and want to fix that problem. So the onus really is on the clients to make sure that they are getting their money's worth when the job's done.
What would you say are the key factors or features of a good client? What makes a good client, do you think, in terms of the procurement process?
I think there are a lot of things. I mean, I've been saying this week that all projects are the same, but all projects are different. which sounds ridiculous. But what I mean by that is that all projects have the same life cycle, but they have their own unique risks. And what happens very often is that companies will say, this is how we're going to deliver it. And then they think about the things that make it different after. And what I think clients really need to focus on is, well, what's driving my costs on this? What is making this different? And what am I trying to achieve? Like, really, what am I trying to achieve? And you have to set up properly. One of the first questions, and the reason we were in contact in the first place, is there a project to be built? What's your problem? And how can you solve this by doing something other than building? Is the first question. Can you put a traffic light in rather than a roundabout in order to manage traffic flows, as a simple example? And I think that we jump into building. Sometimes we jump into finding a solution, looking for a problem, rather than going, I understand what my problem is. I understand who I'm doing this for. And then that is leading me to the right scope and defining the right outcomes I'm trying to achieve. So it's a lot about that setup, understanding what you're doing.
I guess it's mirrored then by the construction process of building before you've designed it.
Mm-hmm.
Actually, if you think about how you intend to use whatever it is, or the problem you're trying to solve, then you've got more chance of defining more clearly.
Absolutely.
And getting a good result.
Absolutely. And I was having this conversation with a client this morning, which was, oh, well, if we're looking at risks, do we really need to talk about operations? Can we just start talking about design? And the answer is, well, no, because the purpose of what you're building is to put it into operations. The design is only in service of the thing that you're operating in the end. So it is, you can't just say, go left to right on this, because then I think also you get the wrong scope.
So when you've argued overcoming the building problem may be to actually build less,
Mm-hmm.
What do you mean by that?
It's looking at everything. And there's the boring, you need to look at your business case and really understand what the options are. And when I think about something like housing, and there's the statement of we need to build 1.5 million homes, I'm not sure that's the problem. There are a lot of people that are in unacceptable housing that need to be in better housing. There are also a lot of empty buildings, and those people might not live in the same place. But the first question has to be, is there a way to solve this problem without building stuff? Because building takes a long time. Planning itself takes a long time, irrespective of the planning reforms. So, looking at building as the first answer isn't necessarily the right answer, because I think that you need to look at what all the options are. And if there's a retrofitting opportunity, you probably aren't going to have to go through planning. I mean, you might, but you probably won't have to. It should be quicker. And if you're really trying to solve a problem quickly, how do you do that? And how do you find ways to deliver that quickly? I think there are also lots of ways to think about policy issues, and how do you, there are lots of people who are living in 4-bedroom houses that are single families. The demographics of how people live are really changing, and people don't necessarily like to move, but can you incentivize people to maybe change what they're doing? Are there ways to incentivize people, and that's a policy decision rather than being a building decision, to downsize, to free up other space for bigger families?
The government have defined this really as a capacity issue, and we just need to build 1.5 million homes.
Yes.
The majority of those would have to be flats if you're going to hit that target. Pete Apps wrote a very interesting article on his Substack last week, I think, or a couple of weeks ago, saying actually it's demand is the issue we should also be looking at, and particularly around leasehold reform. So that's the point you make, is it's as much political and legal as it is the ability to build. If there's no demand, why would you build?
Exactly. And I think there is that. And I think that it's looking at, do we understand the demographics of what we're building? Now, I've there've been lots of conversations in London about councils wanting loads of 3-bedroom flats built. There are increasing numbers of people who are living on their own, or just with a partner, or just with a friend. And, looking at what is really the demand for our housing needs. And, is there enough accommodation for seniors? If there's really good and affordable accommodation for seniors, would they, and with extra rooms for their kids to visit, would that encourage people to move out of their big houses and become increasingly difficult to maintain? I think there are a lot of different levers you can pull, but it also requires, I think, that you look at short, medium, and long-term plans, because building 1.5 million houses is not a short-term plan. That's not a short-term solution. It might be a medium-term solution, but it's probably a long-term solution. And the problem is real and it exists right now. So how do you sort of fitting in solutions that fit into the short, medium, and long term requires some thinking, but it is all, and there are policy issues as well.
I was actually about to ask you a question. I see you've segued very nicely into that. And because we announce projects without really having honesty around supply chain limits, workforce constraints, and delivery capacity. Do we have a skills problem or do we have a capacity problem? Or are they the same thing?
It's a good question. I mean, we've been talking about the skills problem for a really long time, and there aren't enough people in the industry. A lot of people left because of Brexit. There have been a lot of people who have been working in the industry for a long time who are increasing or have been retiring and getting closer and closer to retirement age. And it's not necessarily an attractive industry for the kids to go into. So I think that there's always a risk. And the nirvana of lots of modular construction hasn't really landed, has it? So there's been a lot of talk about whether or not that's a solution to the workforce problem, but it hasn't resolved it either. So construction's expensive, but it's also not productive.
But why do you think offsite or modular construction really hasn't landed?
I don't know. I think this goes back to a procurement issue, and it goes back a little bit into there are multiple stages of this, because part of it is about nobody likes to spend money until they get planning permission. But if you want to build something in a modular way, or you want to build something that's using design for manufacturing and assembly, you need to spend a lot more money actually a lot earlier. And I think that there's this paradox is probably not the right word, but there's a problem between how much money you need to spend to do a modular build and how little you want to spend to get your planning permission.
You've also talked about better decision making. So is that a real skill shortage for us in that the inability to make intelligent decisions early enough in projects?
Probably. There are several dynamics as well, because I think that people who are designing like to design big things, right? If you go into engineering, most people are not going engineering to do a retrofit or to do something small. They're going into engineering because they want to build big things. So there's a natural desire to build bigger things. I think in a lot of the circumstances that I've had, especially working in government, there aren't people who have the technical skills that are actually the decision makers. And so you get into also situations, and this is more infrastructure than the building side, but in infrastructure, what happens is there's a lot of design development that isn't controlled. And it's not viewed by the engineers as change. It's just design development. And then you do a design freeze, and then somebody costs something, and the budget's exploded. And then because of political pressure, you keep carrying on with your design, and there's no time to go back and fix the problem. So this is where you get costs escalating massively. But as a colleague of mine says, you've had this massive cost escalation, but you're no longer designing the same thing. It has changed beyond recognition. So yes, it's way more expensive than what the other thing is, but it's not the same thing. It's not controlled in a lot of circumstances. And it goes back to decision making, and are people actually focused on the right questions?
I guess in the commercial world and non-infrastructure world, there's the equivalent of the professional team designing a building the client cannot afford.
Yes.
They briefed for. Yeah. They want, a Sterling Prize winning exemplar building, but they can't afford it.
Yes.
But that design time is lost. The financial clock is ticking. Yes. So then we value engineer our way into a solution that looks very much like the thing we put in for planning, but is in fact just a facsimile of that thing.
Yes. And there's not a sense that, and I think this is really important, it's, what is your budget, and designing to a budget, and we seem to not want to do that, and it goes back to, okay, well, where is the point in which it's no longer acceptable, and how do you avoid making unpleasant compromises by designing to the budget to start with?
We often talk about a lack of innovation in the industry, and certainly a lack of profitability in the industry. But is one of the reasons why we don't see massive change, and that actually the construction industry is very good at delivering profitability for development companies, for example, and clients. It delivers a very nice return, thank you very much. And therefore, why would you want to mess with that by innovating, shall we say?
It's a really interesting question. And I still think the industry is unique and somewhat odd compared to lots of other industries, because Other than house builders who, often have the full vertical integration, you have a client and you've got a Landsec who I used to work for, you've got one of the other developers, and then you've got a contractor. And you're always looking to the developer to specify the job. The contractor isn't specifying the job. And so unlike lots of other industries, so any kind of manufacturing, where if you're business to consumer business, you're looking for what sells to the consumer. But construction doesn't do that. They're responding to a request by a client to do something a certain way. So I think that's how the innovation can often get lost, because unless the client is driving it, how do you bring the innovation in? How do you justify investing? How do you take those things forward when you're responding to a client request? I've been talking about how can you look at different ways of modeling consultancy, because it's normally bums on seats. You pay for bums on seats. But we have loads of technology now that should be able to be integrated with with people to get better, quicker answers. But we pay for bums on seats. So how do you actually pay for the designing of the model you're going to use to do lots of iterations? Because the value isn't necessarily on hours of people working on it. It is on building of the model and then letting that run. And so the innovation could happen, but the ways in which clients procure, I think, sometimes blocks that from happening, or a lot of times blocks that from happening.
I've just come back from the US, and there was a lot of discussion at the conference I was at about the use of AI and, was it a good thing or a bad thing for people? And I think the general consensus was that it was going to increase the productivity of those people who are already expert. Mm-hmm. Do you see that this will disrupt the industry significantly? Will it allow us to do more? Or how do you see it impacting?
It's one of those things that is too soon to tell, I think, in a lot of circumstances. But one of my concerns is that a lot of the skills you get when you become the expert is through just hard graft and lots of doing, repeat work where you are learning how to design, or you're learning, if you're a lawyer, you're learning how to draft documents. If you're in finance, you're learning how to run a model. You're looking at all these different risks. So you can't get those skills without doing a lot of projects and seeing things from lots of different angles. So I think there is risk that the kids these days are going to have a hard time getting that experience. But I don't think we've necessarily figured out how we embed building expertise with the modeling. We're just sort of assuming it's going to solve all issues, where I think we need to figure out how we use it to its best advantage. So I think about computational design that's been around for a long time, and you can put in all of your constraints and then let a model design, come up with all the different permutations for building a building in London with your rights of light and your, the streetscape, and how do you get your angles right, and all of these questions. So you can let the model run that, but it's not your end. That's not your end answer. You still have to do lots of work once you get that shape, but it allows you to have more shapes that you could possibly ever think of before that. And that's a good thing, right? You're trying to optimize, but it has to work in partnership with humans. I think to get the best outcomes, it's allowing for those lots of variations and then allowing humans to do the things that are really about
things that humans do.
Things that humans do.
Yeah. And that's one of those, is the ability to look at something and say, yeah, that looks right. Mm-hmm. Or that doesn't look right.
Yeah. Yes.
Have another look.
Yes.
Yeah.
But it's also about, does this building work for human beings? It's like, does this thing allow people to move around in a way that people are going to want to live?
It's interesting. The value of the built environment is largely, seems to be discounted by many people. I mean, 90% of us spend 90% of our time in a building. Yeah. And we have people who are made ill by buildings. We have people who are less productive. Kids in school don't learn as well because the indoor air quality is not right. How does that get sorted in this mix of the need to hit budget, the need to operate buildings as cheaply as possible? How do we square that circle?
Well, I think, again, it goes back to how do we think about what we're doing? And do we think about who we're building for? And we do tend to go way more on profitability than thinking about those human beings.
The question is, so I've always kind of argued that the client doesn't want a building. They want a return on investment in a lot of these issues. So again, as long as it looks like the thing we put in for planning with zero enforcement, you end up with buildings that don't work.
And there's a question about, and again, it's sort of when you're a building owner, how much do you care about your customer? And I think it's when we're homeowners, we care a lot about the customer because we're the customer of our house. So we really care about what's happening in there. And and I think when you've got a lot of the real estate investment trusts, they're kind of going, well, are we doing return on investment? Are we a financial organization? Or are we trying to provide a service to our customers? And that's a dichotomy that is really interesting from their perspective because they have lots of investors who want to make sure that they're getting the return. But I think that this is one of the things you also see on the high street is that people who are owning shops want to get a really good financial covenant, but so they're phone shops, which might not be the thing that the people on that particular high street need. But they're not the people who are the owners of the leasehold aren't necessarily interested in that. They just want somebody who's going to pay the rent.
Yeah.
And I think that that's where it's a really interesting split between the end user and the rent payer and the owner.
And society, is there not? Because if it doesn't meet its energy targets, for example, we have to build more capacity into the city. We build Hinkley C at the taxpayer's expense. So there seems to be a lack of social contract in that sense. The buildings that will be there for hundreds of years. Yeah, the people who've got their return on investment have disappeared while the rest of us pick up the tab in the longer term. Does that require then major rethink on the built environment and how do we get people to value it more?
It's a great question because I think we do value our environment, but I think the question there's a separation.
Maybe when it goes wrong though, then you value it.
But there's a separation between the people who use it and the people who own it, and do they have the same? Are their interests aligned? And I always think in any negotiation that you need in any good project you need to have aligned objectives. And I think in a lot of circumstances, we don't have aligned objectives between the people who own the built environment and the people who use the built environment. And that's where the social contract is broken down because it is a financial, building ownership is financial, whereas building usage it's social.
Yeah.
And so trying to get those aligned objectives, how do we do that? I don't know on that one.
No, I think that's a legitimate answer. I don't know. Very difficult. Could we talk a bit about complexity, and particularly from your time on East West Rail? What did you learn about the cost of complexity and how much complexity is self-inflicted?
There's a complexity in a lot of things. And I think one of the things that I've recognized for a long time is that we often try to solve complex problems with complicated solutions, which then aren't implementable. So it's really difficult. And there's going to be someone very clever coming up with a complicated way to solve something. And then when they leave the scene, the person who's trying to implement it doesn't understand it, so they do something else. And at East West Rail, one of the things that was happening when I joined was that it was trying to be lots of things. So really, the purpose of East West Rail is to be a commuter railway. And when you think about it as it's a commuter railway, you think about it in a much more straightforward way because it doesn't need to be fancy. It needs to be reliable. As I like to say, you need to make sure that your kids aren't chained to the fence post from nursery because you know the train's going to get you there. You're not going to move somewhere if you think that you're never going to be able to get home on time to pick your kid up from nursery or school or get to your yoga class or whatever it is that you're doing of an evening. Those life choices are going to be dependent also on your transport and where your job is. And if the objective is to try to get people to move to that region and work in Cambridge Biomedical Campus at Addenbrooke's Hospital, you need to make sure that that train is reliable. So we were talking about stations and do stations need to be whatever? And it's like, no, the stations need to be a shed because nobody should be there more than 15 minutes ever. If they're there for more than 15 minutes, something's gone wrong. So that just needs to be simple and dry and probably some toilets, but it doesn't need to be anything fancy. Does East West Rail need to have lots of, great connectivity? It's not I wouldn't say that as a priority because yes, we want to be able to get to our Wi-Fi and everything else. But if you're on the train for 15 or 20 minutes, it doesn't need to be amazing. The train needs to be reliable so that people can depend on it. And when you can strip things down to what is the purpose of why you're doing something, you can strip away some of that complexity because you're very focused on that key objective, and it should make your decision making easier rather than more complicated.
So avoid mission creep.
Avoid mission creep.
Good advice. Should we therefore spend more time This is kind of part of this, but should we spend more time designing buildings before we start constructing them and make better use of digital tools and DFMA and other modern methods of construction?
I think we should, but I think that even before we start designing, there's a bit of, again, that starting right issue of understanding who and why we're building for. Because you can, design anything. Engineering can solve most things. It depends on whether or not you want to pay for it. So, really understanding all of the reasons why you're building something and who you're building it for should allow you to spend that time in design more wisely. And I do think if we want to move into more manufactured space, we do have to spend more time at the outset trying to understand what products are available to us and how we build them into our buildings.
And similarly, we have a huge focus on capital cost.
Mm-hmm.
And yet that is a fraction of the total cost, the whole life cost. How do we break that focus on the initial cost of a building and saving pennies here that costs us hundreds of thousands over the life cycle of the building? How do we break that?
It's really, really difficult. And it's one of these things that when you look across different sectors, everybody talks about TOTEX. And when you look at water, for example, you're looking at total cost of capital. But at the end of the day, the money up front is what everybody ends up focusing on when you have to make a decision between, should I spend a bit more to make it more cost effective later? It is, often eye-wateringly expensive to do things at the outset. I think it's a really, really hard thing to break because also these assets are lasting for a long time. So those operating costs go on for a very long time. And it looks, each year's operating cost is a fraction of your capital cost, despite the fact that in total it's bigger. So it's a hard thing to break. I mean, probably the issue is how do we bring down capital costs so that we can be able to focus it more on the balance between capital and operating costs.
And does that mean more things like standardization of design? I mean, why should a hospital be different in Sheffield from Manchester?
I think the more that we can look at standardization, there's a lot of other things that are things that I've noticed on projects in that people like to do something new or do it their own way. And the standardization doesn't necessarily just need to be on design, but in the how do we organize data? I've spent more money than I'd like to say on paying for people to set up a project management office and my project controls. Why can't I have something in a box that I can just push a button, it pops up? That's my structure. And then you'd have better data as well because everyone would be reporting data consistently in a bunch of different ways. But I seem to be, I've worked in loads of places where you have to set it up from scratch every time. That costs money.
I get that, but also the data sharing bit, we have a toxic relationship with information in construction.
We do.
The first question you ask yourself when you get a request is, how can that be used against me?
Mm-hmm.
And therefore you tend to hang on to it, which leads me on to, behavioral change and culture change. Surely they're the critical things that need changing in the industry. How do we go about that?
My flippant answer will be bring in more women. Because I think that there is but that's more of a diversity point because there are a lot of people who have the same behaviors that reinforce itself over and over again. That is flippant, but there is a point of we need to learn how to communicate with each other, and there's a trust point. We in the industry, nobody trusts each other, and I think that's been a long-standing thing. You bring up the data point really, really effectively because nobody should be arguing about the quality of the data. Nobody should be arguing about whether or not a number is right. You should be talking about how do you solve the problem. But it goes back to, are people's objectives aligned? Are we all trying to win here? I've never seen any of these things as zero-sum games where I win and you lose. Like, we both need to win together because we can both win together. We can both win together. And I've said loads of times as a client organization that I don't want people to make no profit. I want companies to make a profit, but I also want you to save me money. So how do we find ways that everybody can win on these jobs? And the trust element just isn't there to do that. And it's an interesting dynamic. And there's a whole thing about people don't trust that they can raise an issue. People are afraid that if they raise an issue that's problematic, they'll get shouted at or they'll get fired. There are some really problematic behaviors in the industry that lead to the lack of trust.
Is that driven by contract law? I mean, most of it's adversarial.
I don't know. I don't know where it comes from. But it's It's not going away. And you've had all these different reviews over the past however many years talking about being more collaborative. We are no more collaborative.
No.
Right?
No. We're all very collaborative until it goes wrong. And then what does the contract say? Oh,
Or-
you're liable.
or we're collaborative with each other on the top tier of the supply chain, but down the supply chain, nobody's collaborative at all, and it all goes to really usual aggressive behavior. I think that there are lots of things that we have to talk about in terms of what is this culture that we're trying to establish, and how do we all win in this environment.
So in the UK, we've introduced the Building Safety Act, which is all about culture change, essentially. Withstanding everything else, it talks about behaviour change, culture change. And in the competencies, one of the SCEB criteria is behaviours. What behaviours do you think we need to change?
I think there are many. I think that there is this unwillingness to share information is really, really important. No one is going to get a better outcome if you don't actually acknowledge that there's a problem. So, running 3 sets of books on a job is it helps no one. It makes sense at the time, but it doesn't help your client relationship if you're telling them one thing, you're telling your board another thing, and then you have your real job, right? It doesn't help. So I do think going back to consistent data and the ways in which we are talking about it and being able to have an honest conversation about what is actually going on is the start of how you can move into a more trusting relationship. But, I think that there's still lots of shouting on site and all, and when I go out on site, a lot of times I'm looking at housekeeping, because housekeeping will tell you what's going on the whole site. Are things in the wrong places? Is it a messy site? All those kinds of things. It should be coming out of the Building Safety Act. That they're the immediate red flag that something's not going well, and it's caring about your work, really.
There's increasing fragmentation. And that's, how do you get that message through a highly, highly fragmented subcontractors?
Well, and I even think at the main contractors, you have an issue is that you're not going back to the mothership very often. You're out on site all the time. And so how do you even have a corporate culture at all? You just have your project culture. And often, that's what you've got these very fragmented project teams that are around, and they have the culture of the leader, and that's it. So some of this goes back to the client, and what is the client doing, and how does the client foster the right environment? But it's trying to make sure that the specialists who are down the supply chain are feeling like they're part of the work. And this might come back to design. So and how do they factor into what the design solutions are?
I think very often they know that the design is wrong, but if that's what you told me to build, and that's the way I make money, so I will carry on what I've been told to do in the full knowledge that it's wrong.
But that's not a very good culture, is it? I mean, that's terrible. It's wrong, but I'm going to do it anyway because that's what you've told me, and I'll make money, but then I might have to change. So it's no one wins there.
So apart from having to change contract law, the way we account for projects, the way we design and build them, everything else is
fine.
Pretty good.
Yeah.
It's pretty good.
But there are a lot of amazing things that are getting built. I think there's a privilege in working in this industry because we need to acknowledge that there is a massive privilege in being able to shape people's lives. And we don't talk about it enough. What we do is really important to how we all live. And that is a privilege. And it's something we should embrace as an industry.
I think so. And I think almost everybody that goes to a site in the morning has the intent of doing the best they can. And somehow we manage to mess that up in the way. But we still deliver fantastic projects.
We do.
But just in a really unproductive and hurry-scurry way, which helps we've not even talked about mental health of people involved in this hurry-scurry process. But all of those untidy sites, I think the mental health and the suicide rate are tells of an unproductive system. Yes. So I'm going to ask you a final question on this, and that is, so you're the new construction regulator. What one thing would you change that would make a significant difference?
This is very utopian, but I think it's worth having everybody who's working on a job understand who they're building it for. So that there's a bit of and I hate the word chartering, but there's something about why are we doing this? It's like when you think about good teams, they know what they're trying to achieve. And you understand why you're on the pitch, or what, I'm a rower, why you're in the boat, and you understand what your role is. Who are you as an individual? And then what's the end objective? And if everybody on site were to understand that, would you get a better outcome?
And what their part is,
and what their part is
that.
So it's like you know, if you're a striker, you know you're the striker, but you're still trying to win the game as much as the goalkeeper is. And you have your parts and you've got your role, but you're a team. And I think it is that whole thing in here again, and that privilege of living, you know, so providing our built environment, knowing who you're building it for, and understanding your role in making somebody's life better. That's really powerful.
Beth West, thank you very much for joining us today on Behind the Built Environment.
Thank you.
Thanks for listening to Behind the Built Environment podcast from BESA. If you like what you heard today, then please follow and rate us on your favourite podcast app. Come and join us over on LinkedIn, BESA Group, and carry on the conversation. And if you want to find out more about joining the BESA community, then please visit thebesa.com to start your journey with us today.